On July 27, 2002, one of the most shocking tragedies in aviation history occurred. In fact, it is the deadliest disaster in the history of air shows, with a toll of 77 fatal victims and more than 500 injured. A truly chilling figure. Top-level military aircraft were involved in this. And all this happened while hundreds of cameras recorded the event from all angles, and tens of thousands of spectators watched expectantly. What could have gone wrong that fateful day for such a catastrophe to occur? In this video, we will address the Sknyliv airshow incident. We will analyze the events minute by minute. So get comfortable. I'm Kevin Aguilar, and this is Guns Club. Days before, in July of 2002, the Ukrainian Air Force organized a large air event to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the 14th Air Force Corps. At that time, there were dozens of Su-27 houses available for this event, which in their time were considered one of the most maneuverable multi-role combat aircraft in the world. This fact made the event of great international significance, as witnessing these aircraft in action was not something usual. In these exhibitions, maneuvers as unique as the famous Pugachev's Cobra were usually performed. The popularity of the event motivated the Air Force to put more skin in the game, and when the day came, 3 hours before the start, the atmosphere was very lively. Around 10,000 people gathered to witness the exhibition. However, even from that moment, multiple failures in the organization were evident. Volodymyr Topomar and his co-pilot Yuri Yegorov, protagonists of this story, had requested training flights days before to familiarize themselves with the flight environment. However, flying these houses is extremely costly, and even more so in high-demand situations, so their request was denied. After all, Topomar and Yegorov were expert pilots, especially Topomar. He had 27 years of experience, so in theory he should have no problems improvising, or at least that's what the high command thought. However, practicing maneuvers like the ones they had to execute was essential, especially when they were carried out in coordination with other pilots. Despite the refusal, he was provided with data about the environment so he could mentally rehearse the routine. However, hours before the event, noticing that the number of attendees exceeded expectations, it was decided to change the location of the audience and the maneuvering area, moving them from one side of the track to the other. These changes were notified to the pilots just a few hours before. In the case of Topomar and his co-pilot Yegorov, they were notified just 1 hour before. This generated total discontent among the aviators. In fact, one of the pilots decided to withdraw from the event due to the organizational chaos. Despite everything, Topomar and Yuri decided to continue. The day came, both took off in their Su-27 as was customary. When the time came, they headed to the aerodrome to execute their pre-designed routine. However, upon arriving at the venue, they quickly noticed the place was not entirely suitable for the maneuver. From the cockpit recordings, it is perceived that they did not know the exact location of the public. As they started the routine, they noticed that the spectators were on the opposite side they were supposed to be, according to the information that had been previously provided to them. In addition, the terrain in general had different characteristics than expected. Amid the uncertainty, the pilots contacted the control tower. Despite their obvious disorientation, air traffic control gave them instructions to continue. Following the instructions, they continued with their maneuvers for a few minutes. However, the tragedy would occur exactly at 12:50. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. During a loop turn with rotation, Topomar noticed that the engines had reduced thrust, which made them face the maneuver with less speed than required. This caused them to descend much more than calculated. Unfortunately, instead of the maneuver being carried out parallel to the location of the spectators, the trajectory passed directly over them due to the logistical changes implemented earlier. In the middle of the descent, Topomar realized the speed at which they were falling and tried to regain control to ascend, but it was already too late. The impact was imminent. In. For a moment, it seemed like they would manage to avoid the catastrophe by just a few meters, but this did not happen. The left wing of the fighter grazed a tree that was on the runway, causing a new loss of control. A second later, one of the wings hit the ground, which briefly stabilized the aircraft. However, it continued to advance uncontrollably towards the spectators and a transport plane parked nearby. Yegorov, noticing that there was no possibility of recovery, ejected. Topinar did the same shortly after. Seconds later, the Su-27 collided, spinning several times before turning into an uncontrollable ball of fire, and it did so over a crowd of people. The aircraft crashed into a spectator area, crushing dozens of people. The attendees panicked and ran in all directions. The metal debris crashed into a wire wall, knocking it down onto the asphalt and causing even more victims. The resulting scene was truly terrifying. Among the remains of the burning Su-27, the victims lay inert, limbs and parts of people scattered everywhere, and screams of pain could be heard all around. Both pilots survived after ejecting and witnessed the fruit of their actions. The final toll was devastating: 77 dead and 543 injured. The images of the tragedy quickly went around the world. Investigations began almost immediately to find those responsible and bring them to justice. International safety regulations state that the public should be a considerable distance from aircraft in case of an emergency, a rule that was completely ignored by the high command of the Air Force. The aircraft flew over the spectators without any kind of restriction. The investigation process was relatively simple. It was only necessary to identify who approved these negligences. The first to fall was the head of the Air Force. From there, even several lower-ranking officials were fired or sanctioned. Of course, the main responsibility fell on the pilots. Topinar and Yegorov were accused of violating flight rules by attempting a dangerous maneuver. Topinar's defense argued that the information provided by the Air Force was completely wrong, which caused orientation problems. Moreover, the control tower told him to continue, despite his clear confusion. A failure in the engines was also identified, which mysteriously lost power during the stunt. However, this issue mysteriously was not thoroughly investigated by the official report. The investigation was clearly rigged to absolve the Air Force and the Ministry of Defense, as the investigation was in fact led by the same Ministry of Defense. So Topinar and Yegorov were really in trouble. Topinar was sentenced to 14 years in prison and Yegorov to 8. 3 other officers received lesser sentences of 6 years, and in fact, many of them are working again in the Air Force today. The government granted somewhat arbitrary compensations to those affected, which barely reached $200,000 in total. For instance, an injured person might receive $2,000, while a family that lost multiple members would only get about $500. People received the compensations because otherwise they would get absolutely nothing. After blaming Topinar and his co-pilot, as well as lightly prosecuting or penalizing some officials, the case was swept under the rug, leaving everything as just memories. Today, Yegorov is a free man and lives a relatively quiet life, while Topinar remains under legal restrictions. He is free but must pay fines totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. And to his job, well, he goes on skates since he is not even allowed to ride a bicycle. What do you think of this event? If you like this video, you might be interested in learning about the story of the fall of Chinook 292. Thank you so much for watching this video and see you in the next one. Goodbye.